The hum of the Black Horizon's engines was a lullaby of monotony, its steady vibration pulsing through the bones of the ship. For 3 years, the station had floated at the edge of known space, a sentinel with no wars to watch and no secrets to guard. Its corridors smelled faintly of recycled air and cold steel, a sterile reminder of its purpose, a purpose that had, thus far, gone unfulfilled. Lieutenant Marcus Kane leaned back in his chair in the comms bay, his fingers drumming absently against the console. The room was dim, illuminated by a grid of blinking lights on the control panels, casting fleeting shadows across his face. The silence of space was almost palpable, pressing against the thick glass of the observation window. Out there was nothing. No ships, no stars bright enough to pierce the void. Just the black expanse, endless and uncaring. He stretched, his muscles tight from hours of scanning empty frequencies. A faint crack echoed from his neck, breaking the heavy quiet. His eyes darted to the monitors again, half expecting the same static he'd been sifting through for weeks. Then it came. A flicker, just a faint blip on the screen, barely perceptible amid the digital haze. Kane sat up, his spine straightening as his heart quickened. A red indicator blinked once, then disappeared. He stared at the console, unsure if he'd imagined it. Another false alarm, most likely. A stray echo from a distant satellite, debris caught in the infinite sprawl of space. Still, his hand hovered over the controls. Something about that blink felt different. Calculated. "Can't hurt to check," he muttered to himself, pulling up the last 30 seconds of data. He enhanced the waveform, leaning closer to the monitor as a second pulse emerged. This one longer. 3 short bursts followed, then silence. His breath caught. Encrypted. Alien. The air seemed heavier suddenly, pressing down on his chest. "What the hell is this?" Kane whispered, his voice swallowed by the room's stillness. A bead of sweat traced its way down his temple, unnoticed. He tapped the comm panel, his voice steadier than he felt. "Captain Ward, we've got something." The reply came swiftly, calm, yet tinged with curiosity. "On my way." The door hissed open moments later, and Captain Elias Ward stepped into the room. His uniform was neatly pressed, though his sleeves were rolled up as if prepared for a fight. His presence filled the space, not with dominance, but with quiet authority. Kane instinctively straightened as Ward's sharp blue eyes swept over the console. "What are we looking at?" Ward asked, his tone measured. Kane gestured to the display, the blinking light now a steady pulse. "Encrypted signal, sir. Alien origin. The frequency's tight, and the relays are struggling to hold it, but it's definitely there." Ward leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the waveform. "Run it through the decoders." Kane nodded, his fingers flying over the controls. The room filled with distorted noise, garbled voices, fractured and warped by static. It was like listening to a scream underwater, distant yet urgent. "Boost the gain," Ward instructed. Kane complied, the sound sharpening slightly. A phrase emerged, alien and jagged, its meaning just out of reach. The station's translation software whirred softly, working to bridge the linguistic chasm. Then a voice, rough and strained, laced with static and desperation. "Under attack, civilians. Immediate assistance required." Ward straightened, his jaw tightening. The message looped, fragments filling in with each cycle. "Commander Rylock of the Vorsak fleet. Coordinates transmitting. Please respond." Kane swallowed hard. The voice carried a weight he couldn't ignore, raw, unfiltered fear. "Is it real?" he asked, almost to himself. "It's real," Ward replied, his voice cold and certain. "Trace the coordinates." Kane's hands moved without hesitation, inputting commands as the transmission played again. His chest tightened with each repetition, the urgency in the alien voice like a needle driving deeper. The screen blinked as the computer calculated. "Sector 117, Kane said, frowning. "Closest system is 2 sectors out. There's nothing there. No colonies, no fleets, nothing." Ward folded his arms, his gaze locked on the data. "Except this." Another pulse interrupted the moment, the signal repeating with eerie precision. Kane's stomach churned as he heard the voice again. broken, pleading. "Civilians, we cannot hold millions aboard. Immediate assistance." Ward's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles whitening. He turned to the observation window, staring into the void beyond. The stars were a faint glitter on the edge of darkness, the kind of backdrop that swallowed entire battles without a trace. "Sir," Kane began hesitantly, "what if it's a trap?" Ward didn't turn. "It doesn't matter." Kane blinked, taken aback. "Sir?" The captain's voice was quieter now, but no less firm. "If that was us out there, Lieutenant, would you wait for permission?" Kane's throat tightened. He knew the answer. "No, sir." Ward nodded, his decision solidifying. "Send a report to command. Priority 2. "And us?" Kane asked, though he already knew the answer. Ward's gaze cut to him, sharp and unyielding. "Prepare the Sentinel and the Valiant. Full stealth protocols. We leave within the hour." "Yes, sir." Kane's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his hands moving with renewed purpose across the console. The room came alive as the transmission looped again, its call unanswered but no less urgent. Ward's jaw tightened as he listened, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't protocol. But then protocol didn't account for moments like this, the moments where you either acted or you let the silence win. As Kane relayed orders, Ward's eyes returned to the stars. Somewhere out there, lives hung by a thread, hoping against hope for rescue. And against all odds, the humans would answer. "Hold on," he murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible. "We're coming." The Black Horizons hangar was alive with frenetic energy, a hive of activity breaking the station's usual stillness. Sparks cascaded from overhead as engineers reinforced plating on the Sentinel's hull. The tang of welding torches mingled with the metallic scent of coolant leaking from freshly primed engines. Shouted instructions, and the rhythmic clang of tools echoed off the cavernous walls. Captain Elias Ward stood on the elevated walkway overlooking the scene. His gaze roamed over the 2 patrol ships, the Sentinel and the Valiant, lightly armed and fast, designed for reconnaissance rather than war. Their sleek hulls bore faint scars from decades of quiet service, proof of long-forgotten skirmishes. Ward's thoughts churned like a storm as he watched his crew prepare for departure. Every decision weighed on him like an anchor, but the urgency of the alien transmission cut through his doubt. A faint voice looped in his mind, "We cannot hold." He clenched his jaw, gripping the railing tightly. "Captain!" The voice broke through his thoughts, and Ward turned to see Lieutenant Kane standing a few paces behind him. Kane's uniform was slightly rumpled, his face lined with a mixture of tension and focus. His expression carried the weight of unspoken questions. "We're nearly ready," Kane said, handing over a datapad. "Final diagnostics on the Sentinel's stealth systems are clear. Valiant's weapons are prepped, but we're light on munitions." Ward scanned the report with practiced efficiency. The datapad felt heavier in his hand than it should have, the numbers stark reminders of their limitations. He passed it back without comment. "Any word from command?" Kane asked. Ward's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not yet." Kane shifted, the hesitation in his body language betraying what he wasn't saying. "We're moving without their authorization, aren't we?" Ward's response was immediate, his voice low but firm. "If we wait, they'll be dead." Kane nodded slowly, though the weight of the statement lingered between them. The silence was broken by the crackle of the station's comm system. "Captain Ward, Sentinel report systems are green across the board. Final pre-flight checks underway," a technician's voice announced. Ward acknowledged with a sharp nod, then turned back to Kane. "Get the crew briefed. They need to understand what we're walking into." As Kane descended to the hangar floor, Ward's eyes returned to the patrol ships. Their engines began to hum, a faint vibration traveling through the deck. The sound was both a promise and a warning. There was no turning back now. Ward's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp hiss of the hangar doors sliding open. Cold, sterile light poured in, and the shadow of Chief Engineer Darrow loomed over the threshold. His grease-streaked face and furrowed brow carried their own message. "Engines'll hold," Darrow said, his voice a gruff rasp. "But if you push them too hard, they'll spit out fire instead of thrust." Ward's mouth curved into the barest hint of a smile. "I'll keep that in mind." Darrow grunted, his version of approval, and disappeared back into the chaos. The hangar grew louder as the final preparations reached their crescendo. The Sentinel's thrusters flared briefly in a test ignition, casting long shadows across the deck. Ward descended the walkway, his boots striking the grated metal stairs with deliberate rhythm. Inside the Sentinel, the air was cooler, infused with the faint hum of the ship's systems coming to life. The cockpit was compact but efficient, every surface a blend of polished metal and glowing interface panels. The scent of machine oil lingered, a reminder of hasty repairs. Ward slid into the captain's chair, his movements fluid and deliberate. Kane took the station beside him, his fingers tapping across the comm console. The rest of the crew filtered in, each man settling into their station with a practiced ease that belied the tension hanging in the air. "Clear comms," Ward ordered, his voice cutting through the subdued murmurs. The chatter ceased immediately and all eyes turned to him. "We don't have the luxury of waiting for command to tell us what to do," Ward began, his tone measured but unyielding. "That signal is coming from deep space, far beyond the reach of reinforcements. If we don't act, no one will." A ripple of unease swept through the room, subtle but unmistakable. Ward let it hang, his gaze moving from face to face. "I know we're not a warship. We don't have the firepower or the numbers to fight a fleet, but we have speed, precision, and the element of surprise. That's how we'll win this." Kane cleared his throat, his voice steady but quieter than Ward's. "Captain, what if it's a trap?" Ward's gaze locked onto him, unflinching. "Then we'll spring it." The room fell silent again, but this time the tension was different, focused, determined. "Prep for launch," Ward commanded, breaking the stillness. As the Sentinel powered up, the hum of its engines rose into a low roar. Kane's hands moved deftly across the controls, calibrating the navigation systems. Outside, the Valiant mirrored their preparations, its hull gleaming faintly under the hangar lights. "Dock doors opening," a voice announced over the comms. The massive steel doors groaned as they parted, revealing the abyss beyond. A faint shimmer marked the outer edges of the station's shielding, its translucent barrier the only thing separating them from the void. The moment stretched, heavy and expectant. Then, with a subtle lurch, the Sentinel began to move. The station receded quickly, its artificial lights swallowed by the endless black. The cockpit windows framed the stars, faint and distant pinpricks of light scattered across a canvas of darkness. "Coordinates locked," Kane said, his voice even. "Sector 117. Ward nodded, his grip tightening on the armrest as the ship's warp drive hummed to life. The stars outside blurred, streaking into lines of light as the ship surged forward. Inside the cabin, the faint vibration of the engines resonated through the walls, a reminder of the machine carrying them into the unknown. The air felt heavier now, thick with anticipation and unspoken fears. Ward closed his eyes briefly, the weight of command settling deeper on his shoulders. The alien voice still echoed faintly in his mind. "We cannot hold." "Sir," Kane's voice broke the moment. "We'll reach the sector in 7 minutes." Ward opened his eyes, his gaze hardening as he looked out at the distorted streaks of light. "Make it count." The streaks of light outside the cockpit windows slowed and condensed, snapping back into the pinpoint clarity of distant stars. The warp drive hummed as it wound down, the vibrations rippling through the Sentinel's hull. Captain Elias Ward's fingers curled tightly around the armrest of his seat, his gaze locked on the vast, featureless void ahead. "We're here," Lieutenant Kane announced, his voice measured but taut. His hands moved deftly across the navigation panel, recalibrating the systems after the warp jump. "Sector 117. Ward didn't reply immediately, his focus unbroken. Beyond the Sentinel's reinforced glass was an expanse of shadow, broken only by the faint glint of debris reflecting distant starlight. It was a graveyard of ships, hulking forms torn apart, their skeletal remains drifting silently. "Scans online?" Kane said. the cockpit filled with the faint hum of sensors sweeping the area. A holographic map flickered to life in front of them, displaying fragmented outlines of wreckage and faint energy signatures. "Magnify," Ward ordered. The display zoomed in, revealing twisted shards of metal and shattered hulls. Some fragments were massive, the remnants of cruisers that had once carried entire civilizations. Others were smaller, escape pods, perhaps, or auxiliary craft. "Sir," Kane said, his voice quieter now. "Those are alien, Vorsak design." Ward nodded, his jaw tightening. He'd never seen a Vorsak vessel before, but he recognized the sleek curves and bioluminescent patterns from tactical briefings. This wasn't just a battle site. It was a massacre. "Any life signs?" Kane's fingers hesitated over the controls before pressing down. The scanner's faint whir filled the silence. A moment later, he shook his head. "Faint traces, but they're scattered. Could be survivors. Could be residual." Ward exhaled through his nose, the sound sharp in the stillness. His instincts prickled. Something wasn't right. The wreckage was too concentrated, too deliberate. It looked less like a battlefield and more like a trap. "Stay sharp," Ward said. "Bring us closer to that cluster on the left. Low speed." The Sentinel's engines hummed softly as the ship began to glide forward, its thrusters dimmed to avoid drawing attention. The cockpit's interior lighting flickered briefly, and the faint scent of burning metal wafted in from the aft compartments. "Valiant holding position," Kane reported, glancing at the secondary display. The sister ship hovered a short distance behind them, its silhouette barely visible against the void. "Tell them to maintain a tight perimeter," Ward said. "I don't want anything slipping through." As they approached the wreckage, the scale of the destruction became clearer. The twisted metal beams and scorched plating bore the scars of plasma fire, while faint glimmers of energy rippled across the debris like ghostly echoes. "Sir," Kane said suddenly, his voice edged with unease, "I'm picking up a signal." Ward leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "Origin?" Kane shook his head. "It's faint. Could be from one of the transports." The transmission crackled over the speakers, faint and fractured, as if carried on a dying breath. "Help us. Coordinates. Under attack." The voice was alien but familiar, the same commander who had sent the original distress call. The static-laden desperation in his tone made Ward's stomach tighten. "Boost the gain," Ward said. Kane adjusted the controls and the voice grew marginally clearer. "This is Commander Rylock of the Vorsak fleet. Civilians aboard. Cannot hold." Ward's teeth clenched. He'd expected carnage, but not this. A convoy of refugees left defenseless, their fate now a whisper in the void. "Locate that signal," Ward said sharply. Kane's hands flew over the console, the tension in his movements mirrored in the tight lines of his face. The scanner beeped once, then again, louder this time. "Got it," Kane said, relief threading his voice. "It's coming from one of the larger wrecks. Coordinates locked." Ward straightened. "Bring us in. Keep the shields tight." The Sentinel eased closer to the source of the signal. As the ship maneuvered through the wreckage, the debris seemed to close in around them, the jagged shadows of broken vessels casting ominous shapes against the cockpit glass. "Something's not right," Kane muttered. Ward didn't respond. He felt it too, the sense of being watched, the invisible weight pressing against the edges of his awareness. "Hold position," Ward said as they reached the signal's origin. The scanner's display highlighted a large, semi-intact transport ship, its hull marred by scorch marks and gaping holes. "Life signs aboard," Kane said, his voice low. "Faint, but they're there." Ward's eyes narrowed. "Prepare a boarding team. I want to know who's still breathing on that ship." The ship's comm crackled to life before Kane could respond. A voice, sharp and mechanical, cut through the silence. "Captain Ward, you are trespassing in a restricted zone." Ward's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't Vorsak. "Source?" Ward demanded, his voice sharp. Kane's hands moved frantically over the console. "Unknown. They're Cloaked. The air in the cockpit seemed to thicken as the shadows outside shifted. One by one, dark shapes began to materialize, their angular hulls shimmering into view like specters rising from the void. "Enemy vessels," Kane said, his voice tight. 3. No, 5. Make that 6. Ward's grip on the armrest tightened as the enemy ships surrounded them, their weapons glowing faintly in the dark. "Raise shields," Ward barked. "Get the Valiant on comms." "Too late," Kane said, his voice almost a whisper. The first plasma bolt struck the Sentinel's shields with a resounding crack, the impact vibrating through the hull. Ward's stomach lurched as the ship shuddered under the force. "Evasive maneuvers," Ward shouted. The cockpit erupted into a flurry of activity as the Sentinel banked hard to starboard, narrowly avoiding another barrage of plasma fire. The view outside was a blur of motion, enemy ships weaving through the debris, their weapons lighting up the void. "Valiant engaging," Kane reported, his voice strained. Ward's jaw clenched as he watched the smaller patrol ship dart into the fray, its railguns firing precise volleys that clipped the wings of 2 enemy fighters. But the enemy's numbers were overwhelming, their coordination surgical. "They're hurting us," Ward said, realization dawning. Kane glanced at him, confusion flickering across his face. "Hurting us where?" Ward didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the transport ship at the center of it all, its faint distress beacon pulsing like a heartbeat. "Full power to thrusters," Ward ordered. "Take us to that ship." Kane hesitated. "But the enemy—" "That's where the answers are," Ward snapped. The Sentinel surged forward, its engines roaring as it cut through the chaos. Enemy fire rained down around them, the shields flickering under the strain. "Brace yourselves," Ward growled. The ship closed the distance in seconds, the transport looming larger with every passing moment. Whatever lay inside, Ward knew it was worth the risk. "Docking clamps engaged," Kane announced as the Sentinel latched onto the transport's hull. Ward stood, his expression grim. "Let's find out what they didn't want us to see." The docking clamps groaned as they locked onto the alien transport's ravaged hull. The Sentinel vibrated faintly, the sound of metal on metal echoing through its corridors. Captain Elias Ward stood at the airlock, his helmet cradled under one arm, his other hand resting lightly on the wall. The faint hiss of pressurization filled the chamber, a fragile bridge between the 2 battered ships. "Seal confirmed," Kane's voice crackled over the comm. "Atmosphere aboard the transport is breathable, but barely. Lots of contaminants in the air." Ward nodded, pulling his helmet over his head with practiced efficiency. The visor clicked into place, and the heads-up display came alive, overlaying environmental readings and life signs on his field of vision. The airlock's inner door slid open with a hiss, revealing the hollow passage leading into the alien vessel. The team assembled behind him, 4 men, each wearing the same reinforced exosuits, their visors reflecting the dim light of the Sentinel's interior. They carried pulse rifles, the faint blue glow of their weapons casting an eerie hue across the walls. "Stay close," Ward said, his voice firm but measured. "No unnecessary risks. We're here to find survivors and figure out what the hell happened." A collective nod passed through the team, and they stepped into the alien ship. The change was immediate. The transport's air was thicker, heavier, with a faint, acrid tang that clung to the back of Ward's throat even through the filtration system. The walls were a mottled silver, streaked with blackened scorch marks and faint trails of bioluminescence that pulsed weakly, like veins struggling to carry blood. The corridor was narrow, forcing the team into a single file. Their footsteps rang hollow against the metal floor, the sound amplified in the oppressive silence. The only light came from the team's helmets and the faint, flickering glow of the alien ship's emergency systems. "Looks like this place took a pounding," muttered one of the men, Sergeant Dax, his tone edged with unease. "Keep your eyes open," Ward said, his voice cutting through the tension. He scanned the walls, his visor picking up faint heat signatures ahead. Whatever had happened here, the ship was still alive in some sense. They turned a corner, and the corridor opened into a wider chamber. The ceiling stretched high above them, a latticework of exposed pipes and shattered panels. The room was strewn with debris, shattered consoles, twisted metal beams, and dark stains that Ward didn't need a scanner to recognize. Captain, Kane's voice came over the comm, tense and urgent. You're not alone in there. I'm picking up multiple life signs. Some faint, some mobile. Ward's jaw tightened. Hostile? Unclear. The readings are erratic. Ward motioned for the team to spread out, their movements cautious but deliberate. The air felt colder here, the silence broken only by the faint hum of distant machinery. His visor flagged a heat signature near the far wall, and he moved closer, his boots crunching softly against the scattered debris. A low groan echoed through the chamber, and Ward froze. It was followed by a faint scraping sound, metal dragging against metal. His pulse quickened as he raised his rifle, its glow cutting through the dimness. "Who's there?" Ward called out, his voice steady but firm. The groaning grew louder, and from the shadows emerged a figure, a Vorsak male, his skin pale and translucent, his movements slow and labored. His armor was cracked, oozing a viscous, faintly glowing liquid that Ward guessed was some form of coolant or blood. The Vorsak collapsed to his knees, one hand gripping his side. His head lifted weakly, and his eyes, large, black, and filled with a mixture of fear and relief, met Ward's visor. "Help!" the alien rasped, his voice distorted but unmistakable. Ward motioned for Dax to cover him as he moved closer, lowering his weapon slightly. He crouched beside the Vorsak, his visor's scanner identifying multiple injuries. The alien was in bad shape: plasma burns, internal hemorrhaging, and severe oxygen deprivation. "What happened here?" Ward asked, keeping his tone steady. The Vorsak's breath hitched, his voice faint and strained. "They came from nowhere, no warning, no mercy." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Ward wince. "They wanted the civilians." Ward glanced over his shoulder at the team, then back at the alien. "Who are they? What do they want?" The Vorsak's eyes widened, his expression haunted. "Hunters. They don't leave survivors." His gaze shifted to the far end of the chamber, where a set of massive double doors loomed, slightly ajar. "They're still here." Ward's blood ran cold. He stood quickly, motioning for the team to form up. "We've got hostiles on board. Watch your corners." The Vorsak slumped further, his strength failing. Ward hesitated for a split second before signaling Dax to administer a stimulant. The sergeant pulled a small injector from his pack, pressing it against the alien's neck. The Vorsak gasped as the drug took effect, his breathing stabilizing slightly. "Stay here," Ward ordered. "We'll secure the ship." The Vorsak nodded weakly, his eyes closing as he leaned against the wall. Ward turned his attention to the doors, his pulse hammering in his ears. The faint sound of movement echoed from beyond, a rustling that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The team advanced slowly, their weapons raised. The doors creaked as they pushed them open, revealing a vast cargo hold. The air here was colder still, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood and decay. Rows of stasis pods lined the walls, their surfaces fogged over. Some were intact, their occupants frozen in eerie stillness. Others were shattered, their contents spilled onto the floor in grotesque displays. "What the hell is this?" Dax muttered, his voice barely audible. Ward scanned the room, his visor highlighting faint heat signatures moving among the shadows. The rustling grew louder, more distinct. Then, without warning, a figure lunged from the darkness, a tall, sinewy form with elongated limbs and glowing predator-like eyes. Its claws glinted in the faint light as it closed the distance with terrifying speed. "Contact!" Ward shouted, firing his rifle. The pulse shot struck the creature's chest, sending it sprawling back with a guttural screech. But more emerged from the shadows, their movements fluid and predatory. The room erupted into chaos as the team opened fire. The creatures moved with unnatural agility, weaving between the stasis pods and leaping onto walls. The air filled with the acrid smell of scorched flesh and the deafening roar of gunfire. "Keep them back!" Ward barked, his voice cutting through the cacophony. One of the creatures lunged at Dax, its claws raking across his armor with a screech that sent shivers down Ward's spine. Dax staggered but recovered quickly, slamming the butt of his rifle into the creature's face and firing point blank. It collapsed in a heap, twitching as its glow dimmed. Ward's visor flashed a warning. Shields at 40%. The creatures were relentless, their attacks uncoordinated but overwhelming in sheer numbers. "Fall back," Ward ordered, his mind racing. They couldn't hold the position for long. As the team retreated toward the corridor, Ward's gaze caught something in the corner of the room. A console, its surface flickering faintly with alien glyphs. It was the source of the distress signal. "Cover me," Ward said, breaking from the formation. "Captain—" Kane started, but Ward was already moving. He reached the console, his hands flying over its unfamiliar interface. The glyphs shifted under his touch, their meaning just out of reach. But the signal's source became clear, a log detailing the Vorsak's desperate attempt to escape. And a final message: they want the artifact. Ward's stomach tightened. Artifact? He had no time to think as another creature lunged at him, its claws raking inches from his face. He fired instinctively, the pulse shot ripping through its chest. "Go!" Ward shouted, grabbing the data core from the console. "Back to the Sentinel!" The team fought their way back, the creature's screeches echoing behind them. As the airlock hissed shut, Ward exhaled, his mind racing with the weight of what they'd uncovered. The airlock door sealed with a pressurized hiss, muffling the screeches of the creatures beyond. The faint vibration of their claws raking against the outer hull thrummed through the Sentinel's metal frame, a reminder that the threat was still very real. Captain Elias Ward stood near the entrance, his chest heaving beneath the weight of his exosuit. The data core he'd retrieved from the Vorsak transport was clutched tightly in one hand, its faint hum almost imperceptible over the pounding of his heart. "Status?" he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Lieutenant Kane's face was illuminated by the flicker of holographic readouts as he worked the console. "Shields are holding at 60%, but we've got damage to the lower thrusters. Valiant's reporting similar issues." Ward gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "Can we jump?" Kane shook his head, not looking up. "Not yet. We're too close to the debris field. One wrong calculation and we'll rip the ship apart." Ward turned to the rest of the team, their expressions hard but tense. Sergeant Dax leaned against the bulkhead, his pulse rifle still raised, the barrel scorched and smoking. The others shifted uneasily, their armor scratched and dented, but their resolve unshaken. "They're regrouping," Dax said grimly, nodding toward the viewport where faint silhouettes of enemy ships began to materialize. "We don't have much time." Ward nodded, his jaw tight. "Kane, get me a comm link to the Valiant." The channel crackled to life, and the voice of Commander Oren came through, strained but steady. "Captain, what's the plan? These things aren't going to wait for us to figure it out." Ward's grip on the data core tightened as he spoke. "We're sitting ducks if we stay here. I need your ship to draw their fire. Use the debris as cover and make it look like we're retreating. If they take the bait, we'll hit them from behind." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Oren's reply came, resolute. "Understood. We'll buy you time." The comm went silent, and Ward turned to Kane. "Run the data core through our systems. I need to know what's on this thing." Kane hesitated, his fingers hovering over the console. "Captain, if this core is linked to whatever those creatures are after, plugging it into our systems could make us a target." Ward's voice hardened. "We're already a target. Do it." Kane nodded, his hands moving swiftly as he connected the core. The ship's holographic display flickered and then came to life, projecting a cascade of alien glyphs that shimmered and shifted. The Vorsak language was complex, its meaning buried beneath layers of contextual nuance, but the ship's translation algorithms worked quickly to decode the message. "It's a log," Kane said, his voice low. "A record of their flight. The Vorsak weren't just evacuating. They were transporting something." Ward leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of something?" Kane's fingers danced across the controls, isolating the relevant data. A three-dimensional rendering of an object appeared in the display. A crystalline structure, jagged and pulsating faintly with internal light. "They called it the Crucible," Kane continued. "It's some kind of power source, or maybe a weapon. The logs aren't clear." Ward's gaze remained fixed on the projection. And the hunters? They've been tracking the Vorsak for weeks, Kane said. Their sole objective was to capture the Crucible. Every ship they destroyed, every civilian they killed, it was all collateral damage. Dax let out a low whistle, his tone grim. And now we've got their prize. A shiver ran down Ward's spine, but he pushed it aside. We can't let them have it. If they wanted it this badly, there's a reason. Before anyone could respond, the ship's warning klaxons blared, a piercing sound that made Ward's heart leap into his throat. The viewport filled with light as enemy ships decloaked, their weapons glowing ominously against the black void. "They're making their move," Kane shouted, his hands flying over the controls. "4 ships closing fast." Ward snapped into action. "Shields to full, target their lead ship and fire at will." The Sentinel's railguns roared to life, streaks of molten tungsten slicing through the void. The first salvo clipped an enemy fighter, sending it spiraling into the debris field. But the others pressed on, their plasma bolts slamming into the Sentinel's shields and rattling the hull. "Evasive maneuvers," Ward commanded. The ship lurched violently as it banked hard to port, narrowly avoiding another barrage. Sparks flew from an overloaded console, and the acrid scent of burnt circuitry filled the air. "Captain!" Dax shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We can't keep this up." Ward's mind raced as he assessed the situation. The hunters had the advantage: superior firepower, greater numbers, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. But they had one weakness: their focus on the Crucible. "Kane," Ward said, his voice tight, "can we send a decoy signal? Make it look like the Crucible is somewhere else?" Kane's brow furrowed in concentration. "I can rig a false signature, but it'll take a few minutes." "Do it," Ward ordered, "and make it convincing." As Kane worked, Ward turned his attention to the battle outside. The Valiant darted through the debris field, drawing enemy fire as planned. Its railguns fired in rapid bursts, creating a dazzling display of light and destruction. But it was clear the smaller patrol ship was struggling to keep pace. "Oren," Ward said over the comm, his voice firm, "hold the line just a little longer." "We're doing our best," Oren replied, his voice strained. "But these bastards aren't playing fair." Ward gritted his teeth, watching as one of the enemy ships veered toward the Valiant, its plasma cannons glowing with lethal intent. He slammed a fist against the console. "Kane, how's that signal coming?" "Almost there," Kane said, sweat beading on his forehead. "Just one more." A sudden jolt rocked the Sentinel, throwing Ward against the console. The lights flickered, and the ship's alarms wailed in protest. "Direct hit," Kane shouted. "Shields down to 30%. Ward steadied himself, his vision swimming. He refused to let the panic take hold. "Deploy countermeasures and fire everything we've got. We're not going down without a fight." The Sentinel's hull groaned as it unleashed a barrage of missiles, their contrails cutting through the void like streaks of fire. The explosions illuminated the battlefield, momentarily blinding the enemy ships and giving Kane the time he needed. "Decoy signal active," Kane shouted. Ward didn't hesitate. "Redirect all power to engines. Get us out of here." The Sentinel surged forward, its thrusters roaring as it cut through the debris field. The enemy ships hesitated, their sensors scrambling to locate the Crucible's new location. "It's working," Kane said, his voice filled with cautious relief. "They're taking the bait." Ward allowed himself a small breath of relief, but he knew better than to let his guard down. The hunters weren't fools. It was only a matter of time before they realized the ruse. "Plot a course for the nearest jump point," Ward ordered, "and keep the Crucible locked down. Whatever happens, it doesn't leave this ship." As the Sentinel sped into the darkness, Ward's thoughts churned. The hunters were relentless, and now they had even more reason to come after them. But Ward wasn't about to give up the Crucible, or the lives it might save, without a fight. "Keep your eyes open," he said to the crew, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "This isn't over." The Sentinel's engines roared as the ship tore through the void, its battered hull vibrating with the strain of acceleration. The faint hum of the decoy signal echoed in the cockpit, its synthetic pulse masking the Crucible's true location. Captain Elias Ward sat rigid in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests as the ship swayed with each evasive maneuver. "Coordinates locked," Kane said, his voice tight but controlled. "Jump point is 3 minutes out." "Make it 2, Ward growled. His gaze flicked to the tactical display, where the enemy fleet remained disoriented. The decoy signal had bought them time, but not much. The hunters were regrouping, their sleek vessels weaving through the debris field like predators closing in on wounded prey. The ship's lights flickered as another jolt rocked the Sentinel, a warning of its fraying limits. Sparks cascaded from an overloaded console near the rear of the cockpit, the acrid stench of burnt circuits filling the air. Dax steadied himself against the bulkhead, his rifle still slung across his chest. "We can't keep this pace," Dax said, his voice edged with frustration. "This ship wasn't built for combat runs." "Neither were we," Ward replied, his tone cutting through the tension. "But here we are," Kane's console chirped, and his fingers flew across the controls. "I'm picking up movement, several signatures closing fast. They're not falling for the decoy anymore." Ward's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. "What's their formation?" Kane brought up a holographic projection of the battlefield. 3 closing from the rear, 2 moving to cut us off at the jump point. "They're funneling us," Dax muttered. "Classic hunter tactics." Ward's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and their ship was barely holding together. But the crucible couldn't fall into enemy hands, not after the price already paid. "Deploy countermeasures," Ward ordered, "and prep the railguns. We're punching through." The Sentinel's thrusters flared as it banked hard to avoid an incoming plasma barrage. The void outside was a cacophony of light and motion, plasma bolts streaking past the viewport like fiery comets. The faint whine of the shields fluctuating under strain resonated in the cockpit, a haunting reminder of how close they were to collapse. "Countermeasures deployed," Kane announced, his tone clipped. "They're scattering, but not for long." Ward gritted his teeth. "Keep them off balance. We just need to reach that jump point." The ship shuddered violently as another blast grazed the hull. Loose equipment clattered to the floor, and the cockpit was momentarily bathed in red as warning lights flickered to life. "Shields at 20%, Kane said, his voice grim. "We're not going to survive another direct hit." "Then don't let them hit us," Ward snapped, his tone razor-sharp. The Sentinel surged forward, weaving between jagged fragments of debris. The battlefield was a labyrinth of shattered ships and smoldering wreckage, each twist and turn a gamble. Ward's focus was absolute, his every instinct honed to a singular purpose: survival. Dax steadied himself against the bulkhead, his eyes scanning the tactical display. "One of the lead ships is falling back," he said. "Looks like they're trying to bait us." Ward's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not a retreat. They're setting a trap." Kane glanced over his shoulder. "What's the play, Captain?" Ward's gaze hardened. "We spring it, but on our terms." He toggled the comm link to the Valiant. Commander Oren's voice came through, strained but resolute. "We're holding steady, but we're taking heavy fire. What's the plan?" "Flank them," Ward said. "Draw their fire away from the Sentinel. We'll punch through and create an opening for both ships to jump." There was a brief pause before Oren responded. "Understood. Just make it quick." The Sentinel and the Valiant moved in tandem, their battered hulls gleaming faintly in the flickering light of the battlefield. The hunters pursued relentlessly, their sleek vessels darting through the wreckage with unnerving precision. Kane's console emitted a sharp beep, and his eyes widened. "New contact. Larger signature. It's not one of theirs." Ward's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "I don't know," Kane said, his fingers working furiously to analyze the data. "But it's big." The ship's sensors struggled to lock onto the anomaly, their readings distorted by the debris field. Then, out of the shadows, it emerged, a massive vessel, its silhouette angular and imposing. Its hull was covered in glowing glyphs that pulsed like a heartbeat, casting an eerie light across the battlefield. Dax let out a low whistle. "That doesn't look friendly." The mysterious ship loomed over the battlefield, its presence an ominous harbinger. The hunters faltered, their formation breaking as they redirected their focus toward the newcomer. Ward's eyes narrowed. "What the hell is that?" Kane's voice was hushed. "I think it's Vorsak, a dreadnought-class ship. Before Ward could respond, the massive vessel's weapons came to life. Beams of concentrated energy erupted from its hull, carving through the enemy ships with surgical precision. The hunters scattered, their sleek vessels no match for the dreadnought's overwhelming firepower. The Sentinel's cockpit was bathed in the glow of the explosions, each blast illuminating the stark expressions of the crew. Ward's grip on the armrest tightened as he watched the battlefield shift in an instant. "They're helping us," Kane said, disbelief lacing his voice. Ward wasn't so sure. The Vorsak ship's attacks were relentless, its beams cutting through friend and foe alike. It was a force of destruction, indiscriminate in its wrath. "We can't stay here," Ward said, his voice firm. "Kane, plot the jump coordinates, now." The Sentinel surged forward, its engine straining against the pull of gravity from the massive dreadnought. The jump point loomed ahead, a faint shimmer in the void that promised escape. "Coordinates locked," Kane said. "But we've got company. One of the hunters is on our tail." Ward's pulse quickened. "Dax, get to the aft gun. Take it out." Dax nodded, disappearing through the hatch as the ship shuddered from another impact. The Sentinel's lights flickered again, and the acrid stench of smoke filled the air. "Jump sequence initiated," Kane said, his voice strained. 10 seconds. Ward's eyes remained fixed on the viewport as the hunter ship closed in, its weapons charging for a final strike. The dreadnought loomed behind it, its glyphs glowing brighter as it prepared another devastating volley. "Dax, now!" Ward shouted. The Sentinel's aft gun roared to life, its railgun rounds tearing through the hunter ship's hull. The enemy vessel erupted in a fiery explosion, the shockwave rattling the Sentinel as the jump point enveloped them. The ship lurched violently as it entered the warp corridor, the stars outside stretching into blurred streaks of light. The cockpit was silent save for the faint hum of the engines and the labored breaths of the crew. Ward leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The dreadnought, the crucible, the hunters. It was all connected, and he knew their escape was only temporary. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice heavy with resolve. "Not by a long shot." The Sentinel stabilized in the warp corridor, its engines humming with a strained but steady rhythm. The cockpit lights flickered as Captain Elias Ward rose from his seat, his boots heavy against the grated floor. The familiar sound of metal creaking under stress resonated through the ship, a constant reminder of their precarious position. "Status report," Ward said, his tone clipped. Kane glanced up from his console, his face illuminated by the pale blue glow of the holographic displays. "Engines are holding, but just barely. Shields are down to 10%, and the aft stabilizers took heavy damage during the jump. We won't survive another firefight like that." Ward clenched his fists, his mind racing. The crucible's faint hum, almost like a heartbeat, pulsed through the ship. It was secured in the containment bay, but its presence was an undeniable weight, pressing on everyone aboard. "What about the Valiant?" Ward asked. "Still with us," Kane replied, nodding toward the tactical display. The sister ship's outline flickered faintly on the screen, trailing close behind them in the warp corridor. "They're in slightly better shape, but not by much." Ward turned to face the rest of the crew gathered in the cramped command room. Sergeant Dax stood by the bulkhead, arms crossed, his expression grim but focused. Two engineers huddled near the rear console, running diagnostics and muttering in hushed tones. The tension was palpable. "We can't keep running," Ward said, his voice cutting through the silence. "The hunters will track us, and this ship can't take another hit. We need a plan." Dax straightened, his jaw set. "What kind of plan, Captain? We're outgunned, outnumbered, and dragging a target that every hostile in the galaxy seems to want." Ward's gaze hardened. "We turn the crucible into leverage." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Kane frowned, his hands hesitating over the console. "Leverage? Against who?" "The hunters don't negotiate." "Not them," Ward said, pacing slowly. "The Vorsak dreadnought. That ship wasn't just out there by coincidence. They knew what the crucible was, and they were willing to unleash hell to stop the hunters. We need to figure out why, and fast." Dax's brow furrowed. And if they decide to take it by force? Ward's lips pressed into a thin line. Then we make sure they understand the cost of that decision. Kane leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. You're talking about a high-stakes gamble with a fleet that could tear us apart. How do we even contact them? Ward tapped the console, pulling up the fragment of Vorsak data they'd extracted from the Crucible's core. Their ship left behind a faint energy signature, something unique to their propulsion systems. If we can replicate it, we might be able to draw their attention. Kane nodded slowly, his fingers moving across the controls. I can rig a pulse signal to mimic their drive signature. It'll take time, though. You've got 1 hour, Ward said. Make it count. As Kane got to work, Ward turned to the engineers. What's the status of the containment bay? Is the Crucible secure? One of the engineers, a wiry man named Beckett, nodded quickly. It's stable for now, but the energy output is fluctuating. We've never handled anything like this, sir. If it destabilizes... It won't, Ward interrupted, his voice firm. Focus on reinforcing the containment field. I don't want that thing glowing brighter than it already is. Beckett hesitated, then nodded, retreating to the containment bay with his partner. Ward exhaled through his nose, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the decision ahead. Dax, he said, turning to the sergeant, get the crew ready. If this goes sideways, I want everyone at battle stations. Dax gave a curt nod. Aye, Captain. The minutes ticked by in tense silence as Kane worked to calibrate the signal. The hum of the engines filled the room, a constant undercurrent of urgency. Ward stood near the viewport, his gaze fixed on the streaking stars outside. His mind churned with possibilities, each more perilous than the last. Signal's ready, Kane said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. It's rough, but it should get their attention. Ward stepped forward. Broadcast it. Let's see if they bite. The ship's systems whirred as the signal was sent, a pulsing beacon cutting through the warp corridor. The crew waited in silence, their breaths held as the seconds stretched into minutes. Then a sharp tone echoed through the comms. Incoming response, Kane said, his eyes wide. It's them. Ward straightened, his pulse quickening. Put it through. The voice that filled the room was low and resonant, tinged with the strange cadence of Vorsak's speech. The translation software struggled for a moment before stabilizing. This is Commander Kyle of the Vorsak Dreadnought Sirin. You have broadcast an unauthorized signal using our drive frequency. Identify yourselves immediately. This is Captain Elias Ward of the human vessel Sentinel, Ward replied, his voice steady. We're in possession of the Crucible. We need to talk. A pause followed, heavy with tension. Then Kale's voice returned, colder this time. The Crucible is not yours to bargain with, human. Surrender it immediately, or face the consequences. Ward clenched his fists. We didn't ask for this fight, Commander, but we're not handing over something we don't understand to anyone, not without answers. Kale's tone sharpened. You do not understand what you are playing with, Captain. The Crucible is not a mere artifact. It is a weapon, a key to power that no species should wield lightly. Ward's stomach tightened. Then why do the hunters want it? Because they seek to become unstoppable, Kale said, his voice laced with bitterness. The Crucible amplifies energy on a scale you cannot comprehend. In the wrong hands, it will tip the balance of the galaxy. We destroyed our own fleets to keep it from them, and we will not hesitate to do so again. Ward's mind raced. The stakes had escalated, and he was caught between two unstoppable forces. But surrendering wasn't an option, not with his crew's lives on the line. Then help us, Ward said, his tone softening. We're not your enemy, Commander, but if we're going to keep this thing out of the wrong hands, we need to work together. Another pause. The room was silent, but for the faint hum of the Crucible in the containment bay. Then Kale spoke, his voice quieter but no less resolute. Transmit your location. We will rendezvous. But understand this, Captain. If I sense even a hint of betrayal, I will destroy your ship and the Crucible with it. Ward exhaled, his heart pounding. Understood. Sending coordinates now. As the comlink closed, the crew exchanged uneasy glances. Dax broke the silence, his voice low. "You trust them?" "No," Ward admitted, "but I trust the hunters even less." Kane looked up from his console. "They'll be here in 15 minutes. What's the plan?" Ward's gaze hardened. "We hold our ground. If the Vorsak want the crucible, they'll have to prove they can keep it out of the wrong hands." As the countdown began, Ward stood at the center of the room, his mind sharp and his resolve unwavering. The storm was coming, but he was ready to face it head-on. The Vorsak dreadnought, Saren emerged from the warp corridor, like a leviathan breaching the surface of a dark ocean, its angular hull radiating an ominous energy. The sentinel trembled under its shadow, a stark reminder of the immense power bearing down on them. Captain Elias Ward stood on the bridge, his gaze locked on the colossal vessel. Every fiber of his being braced for what came next. "Commander Kale is hailing us," Kane said, his voice tense. "Audio and visual." Ward straightened. "Put it through." The screen crackled to life, revealing the Vorsak commander's imposing figure. Kale's translucent skin glowed faintly under the light of his ship's systems, his dark eyes fixed on Ward with an intensity that could cut steel. "You are bold, human," Kyle said, his tone devoid of praise or condemnation. "Few would attempt what you have done. Fewer still would survive it." Ward met his gaze without flinching. "Survival's what humans do best." Kyle's head tilted slightly, an unreadable expression flickering across his face. "You carry the crucible, an artifact of unimaginable power. Do you understand what you hold?" "It's not a question of understanding," Ward replied. "It's a question of responsibility. The hunters want it. You want it, but we've bled for it. If we're going to hand it over, we need assurances." Kale's gaze hardened. "There are no assurances in war, Captain. Only choices." Ward leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "Then here's my choice. You work with us to destroy the hunters, or no one gets the crucible." The silence that followed was thick with tension, broken only by the faint hum of the Sentinel's systems. Kyle's eyes narrowed. "You would risk annihilation for leverage? That is not boldness. That is madness." Ward's jaw tightened. "Call it what you want, but humans don't back down when it matters." Kale studied him for a moment longer before stepping back, his expression unreadable. "Prepare for transport. We will discuss terms aboard the Saren. Ward cut the transmission and turned to his crew. "Kane, you have the bridge. Dax, you're with me. Beckett, ensure the crucible stays locked down. If this goes south, you jump to safety. No hesitation." Kane nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Good luck, Captain." Ward and Dax made their way to the airlock in tense silence. The shuttle that carried them to the Saren was dwarfed by the dreadnought's sheer scale, its hangar bay a cavernous expanse of alien architecture. Vorsak soldiers lined the walls, their weapons held in disciplined readiness. Ward noted their precision, their silent unity. These were warriors who had seen the brink of destruction and survived it. Kyle awaited them near the center of the hangar, flanked by 2 guards. The commander's presence was imposing, his every movement deliberate. Ward stepped forward, his posture confident despite the weight of the moment. "Captain Ward," Kyle began, his tone measured, "you stand in the heart of a vessel that could destroy your fleet in minutes. Yet you bargain as though you hold the upper hand." Ward's voice was steady. "Because I do. The crucible is more than a weapon. It's a responsibility. You know it, and I know it. The hunters can't have it, but neither can anyone who would abuse its power. That includes you." Kale's eyes glimmered, a flicker of respect breaking through his stoic exterior. "You are not what I expected." "I hear that a lot," Ward said dryly. "Now, are we going to stand here trading observations, or are we going to stop the hunters?" Kale's expression shifted, a subtle but undeniable shift in the balance of power. "Follow me." The commander led them through the ship's labyrinthine corridors to a war room dominated by a massive holographic display. The battlefield was projected in vivid detail, every ship and trajectory rendered with precision. Kyle gestured to a cluster of enemy signatures converging on their location. The hunters are relentless, he said. They will not stop until the crucible is theirs. Even if we destroy this fleet, more will come. Ward's eyes narrowed. Then we don't just fight them. We make it so they can't come back. Cale turned to him, curiosity flickering in his gaze. Explain. Ward stepped closer to the display, his mind racing. The hunters are organized, but they rely on fear and overwhelming force. Take out their command ship, and the rest will scatter. Cut the head off the snake. Cale's brow furrowed. Their command ship is heavily fortified, guarded by entire squadrons. A direct assault would be suicide. Not if we use the crucible, Ward said, his voice low but firm. We overload its energy output, create a focused pulse to disable their defenses. It won't destroy the ship outright, but it'll leave them vulnerable. Cale's jaw tightened. And if the pulse destabilizes, you risk annihilating everything in its radius. Ward met his gaze. Then we make sure we're not in the blast zone. Dax stepped forward, his voice steady. It's risky, Captain, but it's the only shot we've got. Cale studied the display, his expression grim. If we fail, the hunters will claim the crucible and use it to dominate the galaxy. If we succeed, the Vorsak and humanity will have forged an alliance in fire. Ward extended a hand. Then let's make history. Kyle hesitated for a moment, then clasped Ward's hand. So be it. The combined fleet moved into position, the Sentinel and Saren leading the charge. The crucible was activated under controlled conditions, its energy harnessed and directed through a series of Vorsak amplifiers. The battlefield erupted into chaos as the hunters engaged, their ships swarming like a hive unleashed. Ward stood on the bridge of the Sentinel, his heart pounding as the pulse charged. The crucible's light filled the containment bay, its glow seeping through the walls like liquid fire. The ship trembled under the strain, its systems pushed to their limits. Pulse at 95%, Kane reported. We're almost there. Hold steady, Ward said, his voice calm despite the storm raging around them. We only get one shot at this. The hunter's command ship loomed ahead, its massive form bristling with weapons. Plasma bolts streaked toward the Sentinel, but the Saren intercepted them, its shields flaring brightly. The Vorsak dreadnought held the line, buying precious seconds. Pulse at 100%, Kane said. Ready to fire. Ward's gaze locked on the command ship, his voice steady. Fire. The crucible unleashed its power in a blinding burst, the pulse ripping through the void with devastating precision. The hunter's shields collapsed in an instant, their ships left defenseless. The command ship shuddered, its hull splintering as the combined firepower of the fleet tore it apart. The remaining hunters scattered, their cohesion broken. The battlefield grew still, the silence almost deafening after the chaos. Ward exhaled slowly, his chest heavy with relief. Cale's voice came through the comm. The hunters are retreating. The day is ours. Ward leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For now. As the fleet regrouped, Ward stared out at the stars, his mind racing with the possibilities ahead. Humanity had answered a call that wasn't meant for them, and in doing so they had forged a bond that could reshape the galaxy. Set course for home, Ward said, his voice resolute, and let them know we're just getting started.